So for the next 45 minutes together, we're going to be discussing strategies for supporting students who speak English as another language in the classroom. We offer a course on this topic through the Teacher Training Center. And as Bambi mentioned, we're joined today by two of our trainers for that course, Dr. Ginny Rojas and Beth Puma. Ginny's joining us from quarantine in Florida, and she's truly an expert in the field of language learning. And Beth is joining from Japan, where she works as the elementary EAL and literacy coach at the American School of Japan. In addition to Ginny and Beth, we are honored to have three graduates from our EAL program joining our panel. Megan Walker is with us, who works at Seoul Foreign School, and she is just transitioned into a new role there as the language and academic support teacher. Disha Gadia, who works at the American School of Riyadh, is joining us, and she is a student success specialist in grade 4. And Keith Collins is joining us from Thailand, where he works at the International School of Bangkok as the Director of Student Support. Our panel is going to be discussing questions that were generated by people who were originally registered to take this course with us in Rome in July. So we're going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes in our panel discussion, followed by a resource share, and then we'll wrap up with our nuggets of knowledge. As you're listening to the panel discussion, I would really encourage you to send us questions using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of the screen. And when you send those questions, everybody who's participating in the webinar will be able to see what you wrote, and you'll also be able to give a thumbs up. So if you see somebody who's posed a question that feels really relevant to your own teaching practice, click on that thumbs up so you can help us prioritize questions. And I will also be saving a transcript of all of the questions that are asked. So if we don't get to answer your question during our panel discussion today, we will get a response to you offline. Typically during our morning meetings, we like to share recommendations for restaurants and fun things that people have done in the evenings. And so even though we couldn't be together in person to make those recommendations this year, we still wanted to keep that element of community and that element of fun. And so we wanted to start off today with some recommendations from our panelists about some things that you might be able to do outside of this learning experience today. Most of us have either finished our school year or are just finishing up our school year, and you might be looking for some suggestions or recommendations of movies or TV shows or podcasts that you can listen to or watch in your free time, especially for those of you who are still experiencing a quarantine. So my first question for our panelists is, what's a TV show or series or a movie or a podcast that you have recently watched or listened to that you want to recommend to our audience today? Do we have somebody who wants to start us off?
I would recommend something called Dear. It's on Apple TV this week, and there's 10 guests on it, and people write to them, Dear Lin-Manuel Miranda, this is how you've inspired my life, or Dear Spike Lee, this is how you've inspired my life. And each one of the episodes talks about that kind of an impact. Kind of reminds me of teaching, okay, and unknown people that we might have an impact on, but it's very heartwarming.
Great, thank you, Ginny.
I'm a big podcast listener. It's one of the ways I decompress. So I'm a longtime listener of the NPR Code Switch podcast. It's a really awesome podcast that talks about the overlapping of race and language and ethnicity and culture. And sometimes they have education episodes, but I think it should be required listening for all educators.
Great, thanks, Beth.
Another podcast I listened to, and I just rediscovered it in the last few days because I did a long road trip, and that's Invisibilia. It's also on NPR, and they just tackle different things that we can't really see, like the importance of the sense of smell or the mirror neurons in our brain. So it's just every episode's a different topic, but they're kind of abstract and really engaging to listen to in the car.
Thanks, Keith.
For the last couple of years, I've been listening to Revisionist History with Malcolm Gladwell, and it's described as, looking at things that are either overlooked or misunderstood historically or culturally. And it's just a really fascinating podcast, wide-ranging topics, but really opens up different perspectives for me on different things.
Great, thank you, Megan. And Disha.
A show recently my husband and I watched on Netflix together was The Last Dance, which is a documentary on Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. And it was, my husband's a big sports guy. I'm a sucker for reality television. So it was a great mix and a nice way to decompress at the end of the day.
Wonderful, thanks, Disha. All right. We have some great questions that were generated by some of you who are out there watching today. And so we're going to jump right in and start talking about some of those questions. The first question that someone posed was, how do we differentiate instruction for an array of ELs, both in person when you have them in class and now in our new world virtually? So Ginny, could you start us off with some thoughts?
Yeah, well, differentiation is first and foremost, it's a mindset. And it's what's opposite to that mindset is when you walk into classrooms and you see the same kids accessing the same materials in the same way, at the same time, okay, doing the same tasks. So you have to think of differentiation as the opposite of all of that. Now, clearly, I'm older than all of you. And so I went to Catholic school. That's exactly what school looked like. Same. And some of us, thrived in that environment, but a lot of kids did not thrive in that environment. So differentiation on before I get into the practical ways we could do it, I just want to remind us all that differentiation is not the same thing as modification. It's not the same thing as an intervention. It's not the same thing as remediation. And it's not the same thing as an accommodation. And it's not the same thing as simplification. And I point that out because historically, and unfortunately, those are the approaches we've used in the US, for example, towards multilingual learners. And as a result, we have multilingual learners who 40 years ago were underachieving and today are still underachieving. And so we have to be really, really mindful of, well, if that's not what differentiation is, then what is it? Okay, so Carol Tomlinson talks about 4 things that we can make different in the classroom. And I'm going to do them in order of which ones will help us help multilingual learners access materials. That's the first one I'm going to focus on. And she calls it content, but I actually just call it, how am I going to help kids access materials? And so when, there's different ways. If you're using informational text, like my nephew teaches social studies in an international school in China, and he's always saying to me, how do I differentiate? I have all these different levels of English. And I just say to him, well, you can have kids read different sections in informational text. And then you can think about their language proficiency, and then you're going to have to add a scaffold. So differentiation is something also you just don't do alone. We're going to need scaffolds because we have different levels of proficiency. And so, for example, and if it's literature, then we can use literature circles. So that's groups of 4 kids, and each group gets a different text, but it's the same theme. So if we're having a classroom, let's say discussion, a Socratic seminar on a deep dive kind of cognitive idea, then each group would be reading the same book. Now, I'm not talking about simplified books here, okay? I'm talking about grade level material. But then people say to me, well, what do you do with an emergent bilingual? Some of you call them beginners, but I don't use that term. I call them emergent bilinguals. And so an emergent bilingual, I would let them translanguage, get them a book in their own language first, and they can read it at home, like shadow reading, and then they come to school and they can read it in English. Like, you can do that at grade level. One of the problems with reading levels in international schools is we're always testing them only in English. So we really have no idea what their reading levels, so to speak, are in their primary languages. The biggest difference between international schools and stateside schools is that kids do read their mother tongues. In US schools, they don't anymore, but in international schools, most of them are very literate in their primary language. So that's one way, for an intermediate though, I wouldn't let them necessarily translanguage. I might give them a text in English, grade level, but then I'm going to need to scaffold it. And so I think to myself, well, I'll give them like a reading guide or I'll give them a text framework to help them get the genre and the text type and kind of the things they should be looking for. Let's say, like plot and setting, etc. Okay, and for advanced bilingual, I would give them something like a graphic organizer, which is what most teachers give other kids, and I would give them some key vocabulary. So I've differentiated the materials, but I've also scaffolded the materials for the proficiency level. And by the way, nowadays, I can't tell you how many mother tongue materials are available online. And so those of us who are doing virtual learning now, and I've listed some resources in one of our packages we can talk about later, but even if we don't speak those languages, okay, we can find those materials. And so it's really a bit easier almost virtually because, we can have those materials available immediately in their mother tongues. Now, the second way to differentiate is what Carol Tomlin she calls process. I call it ways of learning. So I'm going to use math as an example. So let's say I'm a middle school or high school teacher, and I've just presented a new problem. And in math, after presentation comes guided practice. And so if I'm a co-teacher in the room, I used to say to the kids, okay, now you have 3 ways to do guided practice. Maybe they're all doing the same problem. That's fine. You don't have to differentiate everything all the time. But I say some of you who think you need a little extra help with the teacher can go to the circle. That's where your teacher is going to be. Some of you who prefer working alone and feel like you've mastered this math, then you can work at your seats. And some of you who think that you learn better from peers than you do from your teacher or by yourself, you can work with a center. And sometimes that center can be a group of multilingual learners who speak the same language, and they can process what they just learned in their own language, because math is the most difficult area, if you will, to have to transfer into English. I know numbers are universal, but thinking in a mother tongue is not universal. That's math oriented, okay, in your mother tongue. So Circle Seat Center requires absolutely no prep, which I really like because, basically I like those strategies that, oh boy, this one's easy. I don't have to spend a lot of advanced time preparing for it, like materials. Materials are quite labor intensive. And so, I also get kids at the end of Circle Seat Center to confer and just make sure that they've made the right choices, because we're supposed to be developing learner agency, and they'll never learn anything about learner agency until they reflect on the choices they've made. So did you go to the center because your friends are there, but it really didn't help you? Do you think you should really maybe gone to the teacher? Those kinds of ideas, especially in a middle school setting or in a high school setting, because, they tend to go with their friends rather than really self-reflect on their learning. The third thing that you can differentiate is tasks. It's my favorite. It's not too labor intensive once you've mastered them. My favorites are things like choice boards and learning menus, different appetizers, different main dishes, that kind of thing. I like tic-tac-toe, although it takes me a little longer because I'm kind of a sequential person, so it's hard for me to think abstractly. And my absolute favorite is raft. And I use raft a lot so you have to be careful when you differentiate tasks, because you have to look at your standard. So if a standard says write an opinion, okay, no, multilingual learners do not get to do a poster. Sorry, but that's not an opinion, okay? And so I think of a raft, and then I think of different kinds of opinions, like an editorial or an essay or a TED Talk, okay? And then I try to make the raft around that. And I don't prescribe which one I think is best for the beginner, because again, I want them to learn agency. But if a kid has overestimated, like, I'm going to do a TED Talk and he's an emergent bilingual, I say, well, what's our plan? How are we going to support that happening? Just to make sure that the child has a plan in place. So I like rafts when the standards are the same, because you got to be really mindful that your differentiation, all kids have to meet the same standard. And the easiest one is groupings. Sometimes you put kids in pairs. Sometimes you put them in trios. Sometimes you put them in groups of 4s. Sometimes the same language. Sometimes it's different language. Sometimes it's homogeneous. Sometimes it's heterogeneous. My favorite is team, pair, solo. I'll take a science class this time. And so a team will hypothesize what they think the experiment is going to tell us. Then in pairs, they actually do the experiment. And then solo or alone, they have to record. They usually do those illustrations and they record their findings. They come back to their pairs to make their hypothesis, verify or nullify their hypotheses. And then they go back to their teams. And that's the theory part of science, right? Could we have done it another way and gotten a different result? Is there another experiment we can do? Because that's really what we consider to be scientific thinking. If I had an emergent bilingual, I'd make sure that the two pairs were the same language, but that it was a heterogeneous foursome. So being very strategic about differentiation and different proficiency levels. And again, for me, the easiest one online is materials at this point in time. Another easy one online is tasks because kids can do that on their own time and we can just check in with them. The groupings you can do in breakout rooms, like in Zoom, for example, okay, and then come back or stop in and confer. And that's especially helpful when there's two people in the room. And I think the tasks are just as easy to do online. I've tried to leave some resources with you, which I'll talk about later. So that's how we differentiate.
Great, thank you so much, Ginny. And I'm wondering, just as a follow-up, I see a lot of people have asked the question if anyone has some recommendation of other tech tools. You just gave us some ideas of a few, but I'm wondering for the other panelists, are there any other tech tools that you used over the past semester that you found to work well with the students that you teach?
One of the ones that I was going to share when talking about how different scaffolds is our librarian introduced us to something called the Explora Primary Database. And it has lots of different nonfiction articles that you can look up. And the nonfiction articles, then there's choice. They can be read aloud to you in English, but you also have the opportunity to have them translated, and they have a list of lots of different languages that you can then have the article translated to. And so that was a really great resource that we found, and the students, it worked really well.
Great, thanks, Disha. Megan, did you have something to add as well?
Just in addition, one of the resources I was going to talk about was Newzella or Newzela, whatever you call it where you are, just because I'm in a middle school setting, and the English learners are completely capable of, they can process the complex concepts that we're talking about. It's just that they don't always have the specific academic vocabulary needed to get the most out of the readings that are done. So I like the ability to adjust the reading level, and so they can access the content at an appropriate level, and then even make it more complicated as it needs to, but you're not simplifying the overarching concept. So if we're looking at trade between nations and how that influences economic relationships, the concept is still there, the concept is still complex, but the language can be made a bit more accessible.
Great, thanks. And we're going to transition now into our next question, which is, what are ways to best scaffold for newcomers to English? And Disha, I'm wondering if you could start us off with some thoughts on that question.
Sure. Ginny already touched on some different scaffolds that can be used within the classroom. And so as Ginny was saying, I think one of the most important things is when thinking about scaffolds is to approach it with an asset or strength-based philosophy, right? Thinking about what do our English language learners already come with. They have lots of experiences, they have knowledge of their own language and culture, and thinking about how can we use all of those things as resources when planning our scaffolds for them. For newcomers, one of the biggest things would be finding ways to include visual supports. So whether that be, real artifacts or pictures or sentence frames or anchor charts that are labeled or illustrated. Thinking of activities that are interactive and hands-on, that where they can participate and be a part of the classroom setting. Thinking about adding on to what Ginny said, finding parallel texts. So having a text that's being used in the classroom and then having another text that is in their native language, which they can read on their own time or listen to the audio for the text. using the digital databases that we just talked about, Megan's example of Newsela or Explora primary database for reading. For writing, some of the things that I thought about were, again, like Ginny said, using the graphic organizers, but maybe filling the graphic organizer out partly and including some sentence frames or, sentence structures that are already there so that they don't just have a blank sheet, but they have some guidance about what they can do with the graphic organizers, modeling it ahead of time and having something that show the different steps and what the expectation is. So having exemplars of what it should look like in the end. And then also providing them choice, since they are newcomers, with writing in their language of choice, labeling maybe in the beginning, writing, sketching. And so giving them options, like Ginny was saying, of different things that they can do, and whatever, every learner is unique and whatever they feel comfortable with going forward.
Great, thanks, Disha. Does anybody else want to add anything?
I just really wanted to echo the idea of coming to work with emergent bilinguals with that asset-based approach. They bring so much to the table and in their home language, and with the right tools and agency. Yeah, I just wanted to echo that. That was a beautiful thought. Great,
thanks, Beth. All right, we are going to go to our third question, and we have started talking about this a little bit, but hopefully we can expand a little bit on our ideas. So what are resources we can use when working with EALs, and what are resources that EALs can use independently? And Megan, I was hoping you could start us off with this part of the discussion.
Sure. So as I was thinking about this, of course, online teaching and learning has been foremost in most of our experiences right now, and moving forward, we're not sure what that's going to look like. So I was doing a lot of thinking about resources that worked well both in the classroom and in the virtual setting. And in addition, as I was thinking about this, the idea kept coming to me that there are so many resources that, when implemented with research-based practice in mind, are incredibly effective, but if used poorly, they're not going to promote growth in students. So I want to talk about a few things, but of course with the caveat that everything needs to be really thought about carefully and used with research-based practice in mind. Disha talked a little bit about using anchor charts and sentence frames and sentence starters and things. And of course, creating those with students when they're using them in an authentic context is really powerful. Something that I struggle with at the middle school level is the fact that if a teacher creates an anchor chart with the students, or I do it when we're co-teaching, then that chart exists in that classroom, but students don't necessarily see the connection between what they're writing in language and literature and what they're writing in science and what they're writing in math. So taking that kind of information and creating a dynamic personal notebook that they can use as a personal reference that they carry with them from class to class, that has, the grammar rule or the vocabulary or the word parts that we're looking at. I think that could be a powerful resource in terms of you're creating it collectively, but then it's fostering independence in them as they look for the right time to use it. We have had a lot of success using Flipgrid in the classrooms, and I think particularly for English learners, it's a really authentic way to practice listening and speaking, which can be really difficult in the virtual environment. And so either it can be something informal, or if you want to practice specific phrases, if you're working on practicing specific functions of language, Flipgrid can provide a really nice, natural way to do that in a very unnatural situation. And I also like that it can be moderated by the teacher. So if it's something where you want students to be interacting, that's great. But if you are, if you have a student who's feeling a little bit hesitant or a little bit shy, you can also have it be more private, just between you and that student. Another thing that I used that I really liked, because I think we've all seen that English learners can, their voices can be lost in the classroom sometimes. I think that occasionally they will feel like what they have to add is not valued by their peers. And Disha was saying, like, they bring so much richness. It's asset that they're bringing to the classroom, but I'm not sure everybody always sees it that way. And we've used Pear Deck, which is a Google Slides add-on. And I love Pear Deck because everybody's voice is heard. And I think choosing to highlight some of those students who don't always feel like they are heard, it's easy to do with Pear Deck. And we've used that virtually and in the classroom with great success. And then I think it's also important to just remember to use your human resources. So if you're in a co-teaching situation, that's fantastic. If you're not in a co-teaching situation, to make sure that you are communicating with the classroom teachers and, you know, training them to implement really simple actions like, hey, you've given a direction, try to do a turn and talk, and or work with them to figure out how to explicitly teach grammar that they're using in a particular setting and relevant vocabulary. So that works better in the physical classroom. And then I think it's also good for us to advocate for all students, but particularly for English learners, that in a virtual setting, it's better to use a few tools really well and in a variety of ways so that students can really focus on learning the language, learning the content, learning what we want them to be focused on, as opposed to, okay, where do I log into this? How do I use this thing? Where do I click for this piece? So that's just something that I think we need to keep in mind moving forward with resources in general.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. We're going to go on to our next question, which is how can EAL and classroom teachers collaborate and share responsibility? And Beth, I was wondering if you could talk about this with us for a little bit.
Oh, I'd be happy to. I think first and foremost, it's about building relationships before day one of co-teaching. Make the time before day one to get to know each other. What do you value in education? What's a funny thing that kids do that makes you laugh? What's the thing that a kid does that makes you feel nutty? I say that because as you're approaching co-planning and co-teaching, right, you're working with a human being, even virtually, right, to remember that. And it'll help buoy you as you're learning the ropes of co-teaching. Next, and this is really particularly to EAL teachers, walk into a co-teaching situation being confident and knowing your responsibility to the learning. You're not there to vaguely support, right? You have some intentionality with being part of the co-teaching team. So you're there to help facilitate academic language. You're there to help nurture translanguaging pedagogy, scaffold meaning and equitable sharing, and help facilitate choice or to differentiate. So you're there with a purpose, right? So remembering that as a way of approaching a co-teaching situation. I think then the next important thing is to know that there's many ways to approach co-teaching, and there's many different models. A very basic Google search will give you like co-teaching models, like will give you different diagrams of what they look like. Print one up and bring that to a co-planning meeting. And then know that those models are flexible. You can use different ones depending on the target and the kids' needs. So do all kids need high-level science vocabulary in order to present their lab findings? Okay, well that could be station teaching, right? Where every kid's gonna go through that cycle of vocabulary learning. Do some kids need some background building in order to approach a task where they need to develop some background knowledge to something you're approaching in social studies maybe? Or maybe a targeted reading strategy group for my elementary teachers, right? That's alternative teaching. And so different teachers have different responsibilities, but it all shifts and changes based on the target and need. And then something we often overlook, but is so important, is that reflection piece. It doesn't have to be a formal like whole meeting or anything, but like, how did that go? How did that co-teaching model work out? How did our kids do? What were they successful at? And what do we need to work on next time? So kind of going through that cycle, and you'll find your groove with your co-teacher, as long as you keep kids at the center of the conversation.
Great, thank you, Beth. Keith, did you want to add something or No, okay. We're going to transition to our next question then, which I think is a really important question and one that can be challenging when you are in the teacher role where you don't really have as much control over decision making. So the question is, how can I, as an EAL teacher, advocate and lead research-based change for multilingual learners at my school? And Keith, I know you have some ideas that you are ready to share with us on this question.
Yeah, and just starting off with what Beth was saying, I think it all goes back to relationships. So relationships, relationships, relationships. And then if you want to lead research-based change, start looking for the research and have it be really good research, not anecdotal, but like backed, peer-reviewed, nice research that you can go forward with and know the direction you want to go in. Then I think sometimes what happens as educators is we sometimes pursue our own passions and move forward with professional development, and we just kind of think that everyone else is moving forward with us, and sometimes we forget that they're moving forward in their areas and their interests. So sometimes what we know, they might not know. So if you're wanting to lead EAL change, then find a way to communicate what you're learning, what direction you want to go in. I personally, I'm vulnerable when I'm learning something new about EAL or something. I go find a person and share it with them. I find an EAL teacher and say, guess what I just learned? So I think having that mindset where it's a community that's growing together and trying to foster that, where people are coming together and sharing what the best practices are, what their learning are, and it's safe for people to take risk and change their practices, which can be pretty scary. The other advice that I would have is try to change your perception of yourself from being, I'm an EAL teacher, I'm teaching these kids, to I'm an EAL teacher, I'm teaching everyone. So being more coach-like. I'm not advocating that you go and say, I want to be a coach, although it'd be great if that works, but perceive yourself as a coach and as an expert in EAL, and others will start to see that as well. So when you're working with teachers, offer to lead something with them or to walk them through a process, or get yourself in front of faculty members. Maybe have EAL teachers join together and do PD together, or maybe get in front of the faculty for just 3 or 4 minutes to do one quick blurb at the start that teachers can walk away and think about later. Or if there's a staff weekly newsletter, write something and put it in that. So just kind of start thinking about what you can do as an EAL teacher to start leading that change inside that school, because I believe the best in everyone. And when people know if they can be doing something better and know how to do something better, they will do it. So like, just see yourself as that vehicle of getting that information out there to the staff members. So I think really 2 things: perceiving yourself as a coach, even if you don't have that title, but what can I do to help teachers, because you're going to broaden your impact. And then just sharing your information as much as you can, bring other people on board. And the best way I've found to do that is with relationships.
Great, thank you so much, Keith. I know this panel discussion could go on for a lot longer, but I'm also conscious of the time. So I'm going to transition us into our resource share. And I've asked each of the panelists to give a quick overview of a resource that they have selected, because one of our goals for this session is to make sure that everybody who's out there has a set of tools that you can walk away with to try out some new strategies, or maybe fine-tune some strategies that you're already using. And I wanted to make sure that everybody knows I will be emailing you later, probably in the next couple of hours, with links to all of these. So if you miss a title or the name of something, don't worry, you're going to get the actual link to it later today. So with our resource share, Ginny, do you want to start us off and just talk a little bit about what you've selected to share with everyone?
Well, since this summer's course was canceled, I thought it would be best to share resources that would have been a part of that course. And that course, the EAL and the mainstream course, really focuses on what we call the 10 principles of CLIL. CLIL stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. And then the other 2 courses kind of go deeper. Okay, so one of the documents that I shared is those 10 principles, described them, and then talked about what's the product, what's the evidence that principle is happening in your school. Because I think, we can't just have principles. we all believe these things, but then they don't often turn into operational products. They don't happen, okay, which is why they don't get institutionalized. And then new people come in and they start all over. So I've put the CLIL principles document in there. Each principle has the references, and the last page has all the websites that somebody had requested when you sent me the original list. And there's about 50 websites that relate to multilingual learners in one way or another. I also put a self-assessment checklist in there that we were going to use in the summer course. It's new, so none of you graduates even ever did it. So if you want to do it, do it. Okay. It struck me this year when I was preparing for the summer course that not all of us have the wherewithal, let's say, in the very beginning, how to coach, groups, but you can always coach yourself. And if you have a self-assessment checklist and you kind of identify honestly an area that you think you could grow in, that in itself will produce change in the long run, even amongst other people. And so I made that checklist for people. And the third thing that's in there is a playbook, because often when I go to schools, people say to me, what do I do? What do I do? I've heard that question so many times in my life that I just thought, well, I'm going to take, the leadership's advice. They talk about playbooks, instructional playbooks having high impact on teacher learning. Now, last summer, we made one in the 2019 class. Do you remember that, Keith and Disha and Megan? Okay, and so I thought I would include that from last summer so that people could see what we do in that course and how it can be used. Those are the 3 resources I included.
Great, thanks, Ginny. Beth, would you like to share the resources that you shared?
I shared a content language integrated learning, or CLIL, co-planner to kind of piggyback off of the question I had for panel. And it really is a adaptation of the many ones over the years from Ginny. So I've pulled some of the things that I've learned along the way. And in many ways, I use it like a thinking routine to help guide a co-planning conversation. So, and then so the second page of it particularly is like making sure, oh, does this lesson include translanguaging opportunities? Does this lesson include differentiation? So some different like thinking routine questions, even if it's I'm the one reflecting on that after a co-planning meeting. Ideally, it's with my co-teacher, but and then I also shared an example of a filled out co-taught lesson for a grade 5 science and language lesson. So trying to model, and it's a real lesson I've taught, and I adapted it a little bit with some tech tools. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight how much language there is in all the subject areas.
Great, thank you, Beth. Disha, could you tell us about the resource that you're sharing with everyone?
The resource that I'm sharing is a book that I read while taking one of the other courses, the English Language, Linguistics, and Learning course, and it's called Growing Language and Literacy K through 8, and it is a great read. What it does is every chapter focuses on a different level of language acquisition, and it talks about different strategies, and it talks about characteristics of multilingual learners at each stage, and it provides lots of examples of scaffolds, instructional practices. So it's a really great hands-on book that you can read and that you can walk away with lots of different strategies with.
I'm so glad you shared that one because it wasn't on the list that I gave them. That's great.
Good. All right, Megan, could you tell us about the resources that you are sharing with the group?
Sure, I have a couple just really quick infographics that were created by a teacher at our school, and I thought were worth sharing. Teaching EAL online in virtual situations, and just some mantras you can repeat to yourself to make sure that you're focusing on what's important. And then also ways to keep your co-teaching relationships healthy and vibrant while you're co-teaching virtually. And then this is probably a resource many of you are already referencing, but Tan Wen's Empowering ELL's blog, and then along with that, the Empowering Language Learners podcast, both of which I have found incredibly useful.
Great, thank you. And Keith, tell us about your resource.
Yeah, the resource I shared is a book on translanguaging, and I selected that book because the first thing it does, I think it's a great resource for any school that's trying to push things forward for EAL instruction. The first thing it does is it really shows us that we're often assessing a child's ability to communicate their understanding in English, but not actually communicate their understanding. Just we're really evaluating what their English is. So it just kind of gives us alternate ways of finding out what students truly understand. So I like that part. And then the second part of the book that I really liked is it really shows how important it is to bring the native languages into the classroom. So, you know, the way that it was kind of like summarized to me was you only have to learn it once. So like if a child can talk and discuss in the native language, the content and the concept that's at hand, then we can provide the scaffolds to get the language to express that thinking. So it really kind of brings forward that, it kind of throws out the idea that you should only be speaking in English in this class, and brings in this idea that you have an asset. Your first language really can help you in your learning, and let's use that. And now when I walk into a classroom and I see two students talking in Korean and sorting something out, and then they turn around and explain it to me in English, I'm just fascinated by that. And I think that their ability to communicate in their native language is really helping them. So it helped me see that native language more of an asset. So the whole translanguaging concept for me has just been a big takeaway from this course.
Great, thank you so much, Keith. And now we are coming to the close of today. And so, as I mentioned earlier, a tradition that we have at the TTC is to end our morning meetings with a nugget of knowledge. Typically, the nugget of knowledge is given by a participant who's in the course, but because we are not able to teach the course this summer, we have asked our trainers to provide our nuggets of knowledge for today. So both Beth and Ginny will be giving us a nugget of knowledge, and we are going to start with Beth's nugget.
I'm pretty passionate about co-teaching, as you all probably can tell. And so one thing I'm passionate about is that it's about figuring out what's right for kids and helping them learn and grow. And in many ways, lesson planning is a political act. The decisions we make about our lessons reflect what we value and deem important. So the co-teaching relationship that serves multilingual students show how we plan is important. So, you know, we discuss co-teachers building a relationship, but also learning each other's roles and responsibilities to those students. It's with people. So with people comes learning and challenge, right? I've had many co-teachers over the years. I think I was counting it up, maybe 30 plus different co-teachers. And oftentimes when I walk into a new co-teaching relationship, they've had negative past experiences with co-teaching. So it's so important to build that trust in the process. And one thing I've found invaluable is a strong lesson planner. And that's why I shared that resource, because it helps illustrate how content and language targets go hand in hand to ensure equity and success. As I mentioned before, you can use it like a thinking routine to guide a planning conversation. And it's not about the content, it's not about the kids, but rather how do we ensure that students are successful in accessing grade level content and acquiring the language needed to be successful in that situation. So a good lesson planner will ask you what models, ask you how are things differentiated, how are we practicing translanguaging, how are we scaffolding meaning and sharing. These questions are embedded in a good planner. And again, you're demonstrating how to strategically plan how we're going to serve our multilingual and all students in the co-teaching relationship. So to build that relationship, being strategic, being impeccable with your word, and reflecting all can happen with a good planner. So my nugget for you today is to utilize a strong CLIL lesson planner to guide co-planning and serve our students and make sure they thrive.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. And we'll turn it over to you, Jenny, for your nugget of knowledge.
Well, my nugget's really a little strange. The title of it, my nugget today for you, is called About the Movie Groundhog Day and EAL Artifacts. Now, for those of you who weren't around in the 1990s, which I'm kind of getting reminded here, okay, that movie starred Bill McMurray and Andy McDowell, and it was about a man who was unhappy and frustrated. And the reason he was because he felt like his life was the same day over and over every day. Now, that term Groundhog Day has become a part of the English lexicon, and it's used actually to describe a monotonous, sometimes unpleasant, and repetitive situation. Now, his quotes from the beginning of the book, of the movie, he said, you know, "Oh God, I'm reliving the same day over and over." Or, "What would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing that you did mattered?" Now, I've been involved with a lot of international schools over a lot of years. I think I've visited over about 300, 350, sometimes some of them more than once. I've been to all of your schools, Megan, Disha, Beth, Keith, okay, at some point, okay? And sometimes I felt like I was living Groundhog Day. Same questions, same issues, same complaints, and same kinds of comments, what I'm going to call shaming comments. And, you know, I would leave those schools kind of distressed, right? Like with those questions, you know, like, wow, does anything I do matter when I go to these schools? Now, somewhere in the middle of the movie, Bill Murray opens his heart to Andy's character as their relationship develops. And she gives him some advice so that he can gradually find a goal to get away from his trapped life. And she says to him, "Listen, you need to stop worrying about your life and you need to serve as a benefactor to others. And the way you can do that is through self-improvement." So he vows at the time to self-improve by educating himself on a daily basis and to do some heroic service each and every of the same day. Okay, and here's some of his quotes from those days. "Wow, that was a pretty good day. Why couldn't I get that day over and over?" Or, you know, he also said something like, "This day was perfect, but boy, it took a whole lot of work." Well, advocating for multilingual learners can give us a lot of pretty good days, but it's going to take a whole lot of work, and it's going to take commitment to continue to educate ourselves on a regular basis. And that's where the EAL artifacts, that part of the net play. EAL certification program is designed around a set of principles, and each principle has an artifact, just so that we remember the evidence of what we're trying to do. And they can give a whole lot of pretty good days for multilingual learners. Beth shared the co-planning artifact, and believe me, it has helped her to shift that school miles. And I know it was not an easy feat. There's another artifact, which is called the EAL Instructional Playbook. And there are entries in there from Megan and Disha and Keith. And I know that they did a whole lot of learning and a whole lot of work to make that. I think it's like 81 pages long, and there's 30 strategies that their group developed. So despite this summer's events, I think we can continue to educate on a regular basis. The document I left you is 28 pages long, so that should keep us busy. There's lots of references and lots of resources that all the panelists have left. And I think that the self-assessment checklist can help each of us develop a commitment to do one heroic act for one multilingual learner next year. Now, at the end of the movie, Bill Murray turns to Andy McDowell and he says, "Whatever happens tomorrow or for the rest of my life," you can make me cry here. He says, "I'm happy now because of who you are and where we're going. I want to thank all of our panelists today. And I want to thank you, Kristen, because that's what the TTC is."
Thank you so much, Ginny. I don't even want to say anything after that. You have taken the words out of my mouth, but I do want to echo your sentiments, and a huge thank you to you, Ginny, to Beth, to all of our panelists, and to everybody who's joined us today. We really miss not being able to be together this summer, and just are so thrilled that we were able to put something together where people could come together and have a sense of community and talk about things that really matter. We are going to be sending you a follow-up email that has links to all of the information that our panelists have shared today. And we hope that you find it useful and helpful in your practice. We're also going to be sharing in that email a link to a Padlet, because as a group of panelists, we'd really like to have you capture some of your takeaways today so we can see what your learning is like. I also just wanted to let everyone know that if you're looking for more opportunities to build your skills and knowledge and to support students who speak English as another language, Ginny's going to be offering an online course that begins in October, and it's called English Language Linguistics and Learning, and the registration is open on our website. So if this is something that sparked an interest in you, you want to learn more, we hope that you will join us for another course with Ginny.
And that will make them cry, but not me cry, I promise.
And I just again wanted to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists who joined us today. You each have so much knowledge and passion for your work. It's really been an honor to be able to have you share your experiences with us. So to everybody else, go forth and learn. We hope to see you with us again tomorrow for our discussion on curriculum and assessment. And thanks to everybody. Have a great rest of your day or evening or morning, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.